The first months of war over the Pacific were not painted in red, white, and blue. They were marked in the silver and crimson of the rising sun. From the day the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, the Japanese A6M-0 ruled the sky. Its pilots, many of them veterans of China, flew with deadly precision, their planes climbing higher and turning tighter than anything America had yet built. At sea, over jungle islands and atolls, the Zero was not just an aircraft, it was a symbol of invincibility. Against it, the United States Navy fielded the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a fighter that was everything the Zero was not. Where the A6M was light and elegant, the Wildcat was heavy and stubby. The Japanese called their own machine a falcon with wings of silk. American mechanics called theirs an iron barrel with claws. It was tough, yes, but in early 1942, toughness wasn't enough. The Wildcat's Pratt Whitney R1830 Twin Wasp radial engine could push it to about 330 miles per hour, with a climb rate that barely reached 2,000 feet per minute. In contrast, the Zero, with its Nakajima Sakai 12 engine and stripped-down airframe, could soar past 360 miles per hour and climb like a hawk, gaining altitude faster than any Allied fighter in the Pacific. The difference was fatal. In the skies over Wake Island, Rabaul, and the Coral Sea, Wildcat pilots found themselves fighting a machine that could simply dance around them. You couldn't catch them, and you couldn't run, one Marine pilot later recalled. The only thing the Wildcat could do was take a hit and keep flying. On the deck of the USS Lexington in the gray dawn light of February 1942, Lieutenant Commander Frank Dutch Keene of VF-3 Squadron wiped a thin layer of salt from his canopy and squinted eastward. The Pacific shimmered like molten glass. Somewhere out there, Japanese carriers prowled, Zuikaku, Shokaku, the same names whispered with dread among the crews. Below deck, his mechanics checked the .5 caliber Brownings, 6 of them crammed into the wings. They fed the belts by hand, each round gleaming under the lantern light. The Wildcat was rugged, and it could hit hard when it got the chance, but the men knew the truth. In a turning fight, the Zero would always win. Keene climbed into the cockpit, the seat hard and narrow against his back. He could smell the oil, the sweat, the faint tang of burnt aviation fuel that never left the aircraft. The deck officer signaled, the engine roared, and the plane lurched forward. Within seconds, the Wildcat was airborne, rising sluggishly toward a cloud bank where the sun was breaking through. It was a clear morning, too clear. As he leveled off at 15,000 feet, Keene saw the telltale glints, dozens of them, sunlight flashing off aluminum wings. Zeros. "They're coming in high," his wingman radioed, voice thin with static. "Stay tight." The dogfight that followed lasted less than 5 minutes. The Zeros dived with impossible grace, their engines screaming, their guns spitting tracers that laced the air like glowing ropes. Keene broke left, then right, but the Wildcat felt sluggish in his hands, like dragging a steel anchor through the sky. He rolled inverted and pulled down, the G-forces crushing his chest. Bullets ripped through his tailplane, sparks dancing past the canopy. His wingman went down in flames, a comet falling into the sea. Keene pulled level just long enough to fire a burst. The tracers tore across empty air. The Zero was already gone, climbing out of reach. When he landed, hours later, the deck of the USS Lexington was littered with wreckage. Only half the squadron returned. Mechanics patched bullet holes in the wings, painted over scorch marks, and replaced shattered canopies. No one spoke much. They all knew the numbers. In the first 3 months of the Pacific War, American naval aviation had lost hundreds of planes to the Zero. The Wildcat was too slow to chase, too heavy to climb, and too stubborn to die. Yet there was something the engineers at Grumman had built into the Wildcat that no one could quite quantify: resilience. It had armor the Zero didn't. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that refused to ignite when hit, and above all, it had pilots who refused to surrender the sky. As 1942 dragged on, that stubbornness became doctrine. On May 8, 1942, during the Battle of the Coral Sea, Wildcat squadrons fought escort for torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku. Again the Zeros came, fast, agile, untouchable. But this time, the Americans fought differently. They stayed in pairs, covering each other's tails. When one turned left, the other turned right, weaving crisscross patterns of overlapping fire. It was called the Thatch Weave, after his creator, Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch of VF-3. It turned defense into offense, forcing the Zero pilots into head-on gun ranges where the Wildcat 6.5 cals could finally speak. The weave saved lives, Keane later wrote in his log. It didn't make us faster, it just gave us a fighting chance. Still, as tactics evolved, the imbalance remained. The Zero could climb away at will, dictating every engagement. Every Wildcat pilot knew the helpless feeling of watching a Zero spiral upward, out of reach. In ready rooms across the Pacific, mechanics and pilots argued late into the night. The Wildcat's R-1830 Twin Wasp radial engine was a reliable beast, but its supercharger was single-stage, limited to 42 inches of manifold pressure, safe for endurance, not for survival. "We don't need safe," Torres, the senior chief mechanic aboard the USS Yorktown, once muttered over a cup of black coffee. "We need a miracle." For the moment, miracles were in short supply. But the war had a way of forcing men to invent their own. As the Lexington steamed west toward a date with history at Midway, Keane looked over the ocean and thought about what he'd seen. The impossible climbs, the losses, the brief flashes of triumph. The Wildcat was tough, yes, but toughness alone couldn't win the Pacific. Somewhere between the courage of the pilots and the iron of the engines, something new would have to emerge, something that could finally make the Wildcat roar back at the Zero. And soon, someone would find a way to give it that voice. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific had become a vast, burning classroom. Every sortie was a lesson written in smoke, and most of those lessons ended with a Wildcat spiraling down toward the sea. Pilots returned from combat pale and silent, their eyes red from oil fumes and exhaustion. In ready rooms aboard USS Yorktown, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, they spread maps across the tables, arguing over tactics they barely had time to test. "Don't turn with them," someone would say. "Dive away, hit once, and climb if you can." But they all knew the truth. Climbing wasn't what Wildcats did best. Lieutenant Commander Frank "Dutch" Keane felt that truth in his bones every time he fought a Zero. In March, his squadron, VF-3, was transferred to the USS Yorktown, covering raids along New Guinea and the Solomons. The air above Lai and Salamaua was an endless swirl of dogfights, sunlight, and tracers. Zeros could leap ahead like white ghosts, climbing effortlessly through 20,000 feet. Wildcats wheezed after them, their engines groaning as if the sky itself were made of lead. After one mission, Keane limped back to the carrier with 2 cylinders gone and the wings peppered with holes. When the deck crews hauled his plane forward to the maintenance bay, Chief Petty Officer Samuel Torres, the Yorktown senior mechanic, was already waiting with his sleeves rolled up. The man was short, broad-shouldered, and permanently coated in oil. He had been fixing engines long before the war, first in Texas crop dusters, then in Navy squadrons. If anyone could coax miracles out of machinery, it was Torres. "She's coughing again," Keane said, climbing down from the cockpit. "No surprise there," Torres muttered, tapping the engine cowling. "You're squeezing her dry. The R-1830 wasn't built for this kind of altitude fighting." "Neither were we," Keane replied. He looked across the hangar deck where other Wildcats sat with their panels off, engines gutted, wings riddled with holes. "You think there's anything left to give?" Torres glanced at him, then lowered his voice. "Maybe, but you won't like it." That night, while the Yorktown plowed through a calm sea under starlight, Torres stayed behind in the hangar. The big Pratt Whitney R-1830-86 engine sat before him, its twin rows of cylinders gleaming under the work lamps. Officially, it was rated for 1,200 horsepower at 42 inches of manifold pressure. Anything beyond that, and the engine risked overheating, or throwing a piston clean through the cowling. But Torres knew that the same engine, on the test benches back at East Hartford, could handle bursts of 48, even 50 inches, for a few minutes. The trick was keeping it alive long enough to matter. He studied the manifold regulator, a small mechanical valve that controlled how much air the supercharger fed into the cylinders. If he could bypass that, even temporarily, the engine would overboost, flood the cylinders with more air, more fuel, and more fire. It would be dangerous, maybe suicidal, but it might also give a Wildcat the speed to climb out of a Zero's reach, for just long enough to live. Torres picked up a spanner and whispered, "All right, sweetheart, let's see what you can really do." Over the next 2 nights, he worked in silence, crafting a small toggle wired directly into the supercharger regulator, a manual override hidden under the throttle quadrant. He labeled it with a single word, scratched in with a screwdriver, Overboost. It wasn't part of the Navy manual. It wasn't approved by Grumman or the Bureau of Aeronautics. It was just one mechanic's act of defiance against the laws of engineering. On the morning of April 18th, Keene found Torres leaning against his Wildcat, a grin under his oil-streaked face. "I made you something," the chief said, gesturing to the cockpit. "Flip that red switch if you're about to meet St. Peter." Keene frowned. "What's it do?" "Gives you about 5 more inches of manifold pressure, maybe 150 more horses. You'll climb like a homesick angel for about 2 minutes. After that, the engine will start screaming. 3 minutes and it's going to eat itself. And if I don't flip it off, then you'll make a hell of a firework." Keene hesitated. "Does the captain know about this?" Torres's grin widened. "Not yet." That afternoon, with the Yorktown's flight deck baking under the sun, Keene decided to test it. He took off into a blue so bright it hurt his eyes, leveled at 8,000 feet, and climbed toward 15,000 feet. The air thinned, the needle crept, the engine began to labor. He reached for the red toggle. When he flipped it, the change was instant. The Wildcat kicked forward as if struck by lightning. The roar deepened into a growl. The climb rate surged past anything Keene had ever seen. 3,500 feet per minute, maybe more. The altimeter spun. For 30 seconds, he was a hawk, not a hammer. Then came the smoke. Thin, gray, curling from the exhaust stacks. He shut it off and leveled out, heart hammering. He hit 21,000 feet in under 4 minutes, something no F-4F pilot had ever done. Back on deck, Torres met him with a knowing look. "So?" Keene climbed out, grinning. "You're insane." "Yeah," Torres said, wiping his hands. "But am I right?" They both looked at the engine, still ticking as it cooled. For a moment, Keene felt something he hadn't felt since before Pearl Harbor: hope. Word spread quietly through the hangar. A handful of pilots whispered about Torres's switch. Some didn't believe it, others called it suicide. But for a few, it became a secret weapon, a last resort. In the weeks that followed, as the Yorktown sailed toward the next great battle, Midway, the idea took root. The Wildcat still couldn't match the Zero for grace or agility, but now, when the sky turned against them, a few pilots knew they had one final card to play. A small, forbidden switch that could, for a moment, turn the hunted into the hunter. The Pacific was still vast, the enemy was still strong. But somewhere deep inside the engine of the Wildcat, a new heartbeat had begun, loud, defiant, and just a little bit mad. The dawn of June 4th, 1942 began like any other in the Central Pacific. A flat gray horizon, wind rolling across the decks of 3 American carriers, and a silence heavy with expectation. But before the sun climbed over the rim of the sea, the stillness shattered. At 05:30, radar aboard the USS Yorktown picked up inbound aircraft. Japanese carrier planes, bombers, and fighters were already on their way. The Battle of Midway had begun. In the ready room, Lieutenant Commander Frank Dutch Keene sat in his flight suit, listening to the distant roar of engines warming on the deck. The air smelled of coffee, salt, and fear. Around him, the men of VF-3 Squadron were strapping on parachutes, checking gun safeties, murmuring half-prayers. No one talked about tactics now. They all knew the odds. The Japanese Zero had better climb, better turn, and more experienced pilots. The Wildcat's only weapon was what Grumman had built into its bones: armor, firepower, and the stubborn will of the men inside. The klaxon blared, the deck crew signaled. Keen's heart slammed once, then steadied. As his Wildcat rolled down the Yorktown's deck, he felt the familiar vibration through the seat, the hum of the Pratt Whitney R-1830 Twin Wasp, 14 cylinders beating like a war drum. The plane leapt off the bow and into the air. Above the Pacific, the morning sky was alive with chaos. Columns of black smoke rose from Midway Island, contrails crisscrossed like scars. "Bogeys high! Angels 20!" the radio crackled. Keen craned his neck. There, sunlight glinting off spinning propellers. Dozens of them. Zeros. They dropped in from the east like silver knives, their wingtips flashing red. Within seconds, the Wildcats were surrounded. Keen's wingman shouted, "They're on us!" Bullets tore through the formation. A Wildcat exploded in a ball of fire. Keen banked hard, the G-force crushing his ribs, his breath coming short. Tracers whipped past his canopy, green, white, red. The Zero behind him stayed glued to his tail, matching every roll, every dive. Keen slammed the throttle forward. The engine screamed. The altimeter spun down, 12,000 feet, 10, 8. He pulled up, nose high, trying to climb, but the Zero climbed faster. The Japanese pilot was toying with him, confident, waiting for the perfect shot. "Hang on, Dutch," another voice crackled through the static. It was Lieutenant Tom Everett, his section leader. Everett dove through the melee, his Wildcat trailing smoke. "Break right, now!" Keen rolled, the Zero overshooting by inches. Everett fired, the tracers stitching across the sky, but the Zero flicked upward in a tight spiral and vanished into the sun. "They're playing with us," Everett growled. Keen didn't answer. His hands were slick on the stick. The air in the cockpit was thick and hot, the temperature climbing as the Twin Wasp struggled for breath. He thought about Torres, about that red switch hidden under the throttle. He hesitated. Every manual said 42 inches manifold pressure was the limit. He reached down. His fingers brushed the toggle. The metal was warm. For half a second, he hesitated. Then he flicked it up. The change was instant. The engine's note dropped to a deeper growl, the entire aircraft shuddering as raw power surged through the cylinders. The Wildcat lunged forward, climbing like it never had before. The G's slammed him into the seat, but the altimeter spun upward, 15,000 feet, 17, 19. The Zero on his tail struggled to follow. Its engine whined thinly in the thinner air. Keen pushed harder, sweat dripping into his eyes. He could feel the heat rising from the floorboards, the engine running on borrowed life. "Come on, old girl, just a little longer." He broke through the top of a cloud layer, sunlight exploding across the canopy. The Zero burst out behind him, but now, for the first time, Keen had the advantage. He pulled back, rolled over, and dove, a perfect high-side reversal. The Wildcat screamed downward, the .50 calibers thundering. The tracers caught the Zero across the fuselage. The Japanese plane jerked once, then disintegrated into flame, a streak of smoke plunging toward the ocean far below. Keen leveled out, heart hammering. "Splash 1," he muttered. His voice shook, but there was no time to celebrate. More Zeros were coming. The radio crackled with chaos, calls for help, broken transmissions, screams. Keen looked down. The sea was littered with burning aircraft, oil slicks stretching for miles. He turned toward the carriers, but the sky was filled with movement. Japanese dive bombers, escorted by fresh Zeros, were bearing down on the American fleet. Below, the Yorktown's anti-aircraft batteries opened up, filling the air with black bursts of flak. Keen pushed the throttle to the limit, the needle trembling near the red line. He dove straight into the formation. "Overboost again!" he whispered. He flicked the switch. The Wildcat roared. For a few impossible moments, he became the hunter. The airframe rattled. The manifold pressure gauge screamed past 48 inches. He fired into the bombers, cutting one apart, then another. The sky became a storm of tracers and smoke. Then, a violent jolt, a shudder through the wings. Warning lights blinked red. The engine coughed, then caught again, sputtering. He'd pushed it too far. Keen shut the switch off, coaxing the power back. "Hold together," he begged. "Just hold together." The attack broke apart. The bombers scattered, several trailing smoke. The Yorktown took hits, bombs slamming into her deck and fires breaking out, but she still floated. The Wildcats had done enough to blunt the strike. By the time Keene landed, the deck was chaos. Fire crews spraying foam, wounded men being carried below. He taxied in, engine ticking and popping. Torres ran to meet him, eyes wide. "Did you—" "Yeah," Keene gasped, pulling off his helmet. "It works." Torres looked at the smoking exhausts. "How long did you run it?" "Long enough to kill a Zero." The mechanic laughed once, shakily. "You're going to get me court-martialed." Keene grinned, teeth white against the soot on his face. "Then make it worth it. Install one in every bird we've got." That night, as the fires on the Yorktown were finally extinguished, Keene stood alone on the flight deck. The air smelled of burned oil and salt. Far on the horizon, the glow of explosions marked where Japanese carriers were dying, hit by American dive bombers launched hours earlier. The tide of the Pacific was turning. The Wildcat hadn't become faster than the Zero. It hadn't become prettier or lighter. But somewhere over Midway, for a few desperate minutes, one battered American fighter had climbed higher than anyone thought possible, powered by nothing more than a mechanic's courage and a pilot's will to live. And in that moment, the sky no longer belonged entirely to the rising sun.
The victory at Midway changed everything, on maps, in morale, and in myth. But for the men who had fought it, the aftertaste was more complex, equal parts triumph and fatigue, laced with the smell of scorched engines. When the surviving Wildcats limped back to Pearl Harbor, their fuselages pocked with bullet holes and their engines coated in salt and soot, mechanics crawled over them like surgeons. Many were amazed they had even made it home. Chief Samuel Torres wasn't surprised. He had seen what overboosting did. Inside the hangar at Ford Island, engines were torn apart on wooden benches. Cylinders warped, valves cracked, pistons melted. Each one told the same story. A few minutes of impossible power followed by mechanical ruin. "It's like giving a heart attack to an old man," one mechanic said. Torres just nodded. He knew. But he also knew that sometimes those few minutes had saved entire squadrons. Reports trickled up the chain of command. Pilots mentioned emergency manifold overrides in their logs. Officers raised eyebrows. The Bureau of Aeronautics issued a quiet memo warning against unauthorized engine modifications. Still, the rumors spread through the fleet, a whisper of defiance wrapped in steel. Somewhere between official orders and the desperation of survival, the Overboost Switch had become part legend, part taboo. On USS Enterprise, a new wave of pilots took up the fight during the Guadalcanal campaign. The conditions were brutal: endless humidity, fuel shortages, and daily skirmishes with the Japanese. The Wildcats were still the Navy's frontline fighters, facing the Zero over jungles and sea. By now, some pilots had heard about Torres's miracle. A few had even seen diagrams, crude sketches passed between maintenance crews. In the cramped repair bays of Henderson Field, where planes were patched with tin and prayer, Torres's idea quietly took root again. Keene's name was whispered like a ghost. He had become a symbol, not of perfection, but of defiance. His logbook from Midway circulated among the squadrons. Scrawled in grease pencil on the last page were his words: "If you need heaven's help, make it yourself." In August, as the battle for Guadalcanal reached its peak, a young Marine pilot named Lieutenant Jack Hollis flew an F-4F-4 equipped with a similar overboost mod. It wasn't Torres's work. Some mechanic on the ground had copied it, inspired by the story. When Hollis found himself cornered by 3 Zeros above Iron Bottom Sound, he flipped the toggle. The Wildcat surged forward, climbing sharply enough to make his vision blur. He looped behind one of the Japanese fighters and fired. The Zero burst into flame, the others broke off. Hollis landed with the engine howling and oil spraying across his windshield, but alive. The next day, his mechanic found half the pistons cracked. The engine was ruined, but so were the myths about the Wildcat being helpless. Word of Hollis's escape reached Torres weeks later through a pilot ferrying parts to Pearl Harbor. He said nothing, but that night he sat on a crate staring at the dark water beyond the harbor lights. "They're still using it," a younger mechanic said quietly. Torres sighed. "Yeah, and they'll burn up half the Pacific doing it." He smiled faintly, though. But maybe that's what winning looks like, breaking things faster than the other guy. The Navy never officially adopted his modification, but the lessons it taught didn't die. Engineers at Grumman began experimenting with new engines and emergency boost systems for the next generation of carrier fighters. The F-6F Hellcat, already in development, would be built around the Pratt Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, nearly twice the power of the old Twin Wasp. It would have a proper war emergency power setting, allowing safe bursts of extra boost without melting itself apart. Torres's reckless idea had simply become doctrine, refined by science and sanctioned by command. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the cost of those experiments kept piling up. Every week, Wildcats returned to Henderson Field with scorched engines. Mechanics worked through the night, cannibalizing wrecks to keep the rest flying. When the Japanese attacked at dawn, the same patched-up planes roared back into the air. There was no rest, no glory, just a grim rhythm. Fly, fight, fix, repeat. By late October, Guadalcanal skies belonged to neither side. They were filled with smoke and ghosts. Pilots called it the slot, a narrow channel between islands that swallowed men and machines. Every time a Wildcat climbed into that gray void, it carried the echoes of those who had flown before, and the faint, dangerous hope that for a few minutes it could still match a Zero's grace. One humid night, Hollis and his mechanics sat beside their grounded Wildcat, drinking from tin cups of lukewarm coffee. The young Marine stared at the plane's battered fuselage. "You ever think this thing's got a soul?" he asked. The mechanic shrugged. "If it does, it's borrowed." Hollis smiled. "Then let's borrow a little more tomorrow." The next morning, he took off again. He never came back. His wreck was never found, but his final radio call was logged at 0812 hours. Switch on. When Torres read the report months later, he folded it carefully and slipped it into his tool chest. For the rest of the war, he refused to build another Overboost Switch, but he didn't regret it. He told a fellow chief years later, he knew what it could do. He also knew what it cost. By the end of 1942, the Wildcat had been pushed to its limits, mechanically, physically, spiritually. Yet somehow it had survived. Against all logic, the stubby little fighter had carried the Navy through the darkest year of the Pacific War. And though the Hellcat and Corsair were already on the horizon, every pilot who climbed into those newer, faster machines would owe something to the rough, dangerous lessons written in the logbooks of the F-4F and to the men who risked everything to make steel climb higher than it should. Somewhere in the maintenance bay of Pearl Harbor, an old Twin Wasp engine sat on a bench, its pistons scorched black. Torres walked past it one last time before shipping out. He stopped, ran a hand over the cracked metal, and whispered, "You gave everything you had." Outside, the sound of a Hellcat's engine rolled across the airfield, deeper, stronger, confident. The future had arrived, but it carried with it the heartbeat of every Wildcat that had dared to roar beyond its limits, and the ghost of one small red switch that had once defied gravity and fate for just a few fleeting minutes of borrowed power.
By early 1943, the Pacific sky had changed color. The blue that once belonged to the rising sun was now streaked with contrails from a new kind of fighter, faster, stronger, born from the ashes of every Wildcat that fell before it. The F-6F Hellcat had arrived. It was the child of everything learned in blood and smoke. A bigger frame, a tougher hide, and an engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, that could unleash nearly twice the horsepower of the old F-4F. Officially, it came with something engineers called war emergency power. Unofficially, the pilots nicknamed it the Overboost done right. From the outside, the Hellcat looked like the Wildcat's older brother, heavier shoulders, wider wings, but inside, it carried the DNA of every desperate experiment, every red switch flipped in defiance. Grumman's designers had studied the Wildcat's combat reports line by line. They'd read about the Overboost Switch, the melted pistons, the unapproved modifications that saved lives. One engineer, decades later, would admit,
We all knew about Torres's trick, we just decided to make it legal. But back in 1943, none of that mattered to the men still flying. To them, the Wildcat wasn't a relic, it was memory made of metal. The USS Bogue, one of the Navy's new escort carriers, still flew Wildcats during the anti-submarine patrols of the Atlantic. On her deck, among the smell of fuel and salt, younger pilots who'd missed the early Pacific battles listened to veterans tell stories. They spoke of Midway, of Wake Island, of the days when the Zero owned the sky, and of a mechanic who wired a forbidden switch under the throttle. They told it half like a confession, half like a legend. He wasn't an engineer, one would say. He was a believer. Believed machines could keep up with men if you gave them enough heart. In April 1943, Chief Samuel Torres was reassigned to the mainland, overseeing a stateside maintenance school at NAS Alameda. He walked the hangars where new recruits learned to strip and rebuild engines. Rows of pristine double wasps gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The war had become an industry now, clean, efficient, endless. Yet as he listened to instructors lecture about proper boost management, Torres couldn't help but smile. The manual spoke of short-duration power bursts permitted under combat conditions. To him, it sounded familiar. That night, he stayed late, walking between the rows of engines, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. He thought about Keene, about the red switch, about the first Wildcat that had clawed its way into the thin air above Midway. "We built that," he murmured to the silence, "with our hands, with our fear." Across the ocean, the war burned on. The Hellcat now faced the Zero's successor, the A6M5, and turned the tables completely. In the Marianas, at Philippine Sea, at Formosa, the results were one-sided. American pilots returned from missions with kill ratios that defied belief, 13-1, 19-1. The headlines called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But veterans of 1942 knew better. They remembered when the odds were reversed, when survival itself was victory. In one squadron, a Hellcat pilot painted a tiny red lightning bolt beneath his cockpit canopy, a quiet tribute to the switch his predecessors once flipped in desperation. When asked about it, he only smiled and said, "It's for the ones who climbed before us." After the war, in 1946, the Smithsonian's National Air Museum received a shipment of decommissioned aircraft from Pearl Harbor storage. Among them was a battered F-4F-4 Wildcat, serial number 5245. Its logbook bore the signature Lieutenant Commander F. Keene, VF-3. The museum staff intended to scrap it for parts, but a curator noticed something odd during inspection. A small hand-wired toggle hidden under the throttle assembly, its label scratched into the metal. Overboost. They left it in place. Years later, visitors would stop in front of that Wildcat, the stubby blue fighter, sitting silent under soft museum light. Children pressed their hands against the glass, staring at the rows of bullet holes patched with rivets. Few noticed the tiny red switch inside the cockpit. But for those who did, it became a symbol of something larger than technology. A plaque below the display read, "This aircraft represents the courage and innovation of early U.S. Navy aviators and their crews. When outmatched, they did not surrender. They adapted." No mention of Torres, no mention of Keene. Just a single line beneath it, etched in bronze. For a few borrowed seconds of power, they changed the balance of the Pacific. Torres visited the museum once, years later, long after the war. He stood quietly before the Wildcat, hat in hand, gray now, his uniform replaced by a factory jacket. He didn't need the plaque to remember. He reached out, fingers brushing the cold glass. For a moment he could almost hear the Twin Wasp again, coughing, roaring, straining against the limits of physics. He could almost see Keene in the cockpit, sunlight flashing off his goggles. They said it couldn't climb. Guess we proved them wrong. Across the ocean, the war burned on. The Hellcat now faced the Zero's successor, the A6M5, and turned the tables completely. Outside, the world had moved on. Jet engines roared on modern runways. The Navy had traded propellers for turbines, decks for catapults. Yet in the stories told in ready rooms and classrooms, the lesson of the Wildcat endured. Every generation of pilots learned it in their own way, that courage is not born from superiority, but from defiance, that sometimes survival depends on breaking a rule, and that even the smallest act of ingenuity, a wire, a switch, a moment of overboost, can tilt the course of history. In the end, the Wildcat's legacy was not speed or grace or beauty. It was persistence. It was the sound of a radial engine straining beyond its limits, of men refusing to accept what the sky said was impossible. And somewhere over the endless Pacific, in the echo of the clouds, that sound still lingers, the growl of a machine that dared to roar louder than it should, and the heartbeat of those who made it fly.